All right. Good morning. Let's get started. So we're continuing our discussion of the legacy of Pope Benedict XVI. Our session this morning is entitled Christianity and Culture, particularly themed after his famous address at the Collège de Bernardin in 2008. I have three distinguished speakers to introduce this morning. I'll just let you know briefly that I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, and I'm very honored to be drafted as chair this morning. So we will be joined virtually by Remy Brague, a French historian of philosophy specializing in Islamic, Jewish, and Christian thought of the Middle Ages. He's professor emeritus of medieval and Arabic philosophy at the Sorbonne, and holds the Romano Guardini Chair of Philosophy at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. He's a member of the Institut de France, the Academy of Moral and Political Sciences, and in 2012 he was awarded the Ratzinger Prize by Pope Benedict XVI and the Ratzinger Foundation, which is also represented here. We will also hear first, actually due to the technical situation, from Mother Mary Krista Nutt. She's a member of the Religious Sisters of Mercy of Alma, Michigan. She has served on the General Council of her institute and is currently serving as the Superior General in Alma, where she teaches Thomistic philosophy and theology to the postulants and novices. Mother Mary Krista earned her baccalaureate license of sacred theology and a doctoral degree in moral theology, all at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. And thirdly, we'll hear from, second in our order of events, Father Maurice Agba Ebaye Ashley, who is a priest of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Mamfe in Cameroon. His research interests include the theological opus of Joseph Ratzinger, the philosophy of religion and German idealism, African literature and Christianity in Africa, and secularism, religion, and politics. He has taught and continues to teach courses in philosophy and theology at Boston College, Merrimack College in Andover, Massachusetts, the Catholic University of Cameroon in Bamenda, Cameroon, St. John's Seminary in Brighton, Massachusetts, and also Pope St. John the 23rd National Seminary in Weston, Mass. Please join me in welcoming these three distinguished speakers this morning. So we'll hear first from Mother Mary Krista.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to offer simple comments on the address of Pope Benedict XVI at the Collège de Bernardin. The basic theme of the address of Pope Benedict XVI's address given in Paris at the monastery he highlights was built by the sons of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux is that the monastic culture, and in particular Benedictine monastic culture, was foundational for European culture and Western theology. The former Holy Father's address outlines the characteristics of monastic life that formed its culture, and by implication characterized the roots of Western culture and theology. He highlighted as what shaped the monastic tradition, in particular, searching for the eternal, the definitive, the essential, beyond the temporal, inessential, and provisional. This search was pursued by way of listening to the Word of God in Scripture, in prayer, in vocal singing, in chanting, in a mode that resonates with and seeks the inner laws of God and the truth of God and his heavens. It is a listening to the Word within history, in communion with others in the Church. His address also contains a warning. that the culture of Europe depends upon these characteristics, and if they are lost, any genuine culture will also be lost. As a Thomist and a religious woman, I'd like to do what I know best, which is to take the time I have with you this morning to simply think with Aquinas about Pope Benedict XVI's address. More specifically, I'd like to consider how Aquinas' doctrine of the virtue of religion complements the thought of Pope Benedict XVI on the characteristics of monastic life as the root of Western culture and theology. I propose that undergirding Pope Benedict XVI's thesis that European culture is deeply indebted to monasticism, there is also an intuition about the radical importance of worship and liturgy to human existence, happiness, and culture that parallels the doctrine of St. Thomas Aquinas on the importance of the virtue of religion to the personal and common life of all men and women in fundamental ways. For Aquinas, though all persons and Christians ought to participate and practice in the virtue of religion, it is uniquely within the monastic life that the potential to deepen the virtue of religion is radically fostered. The vows of religion help to form the virtue of religion within the individual monk who vows, and these vows are expressed outwardly within a community of vowed persons. Over time, living religious life in common develops a communion of persons increasingly oriented to the transcendent God. One might also say religious life tends to form a culture of persons shaped by an obediential search for God, carried out with their entire selves. For this reason, religious take their name after the primary virtue fostered in their life. In the time I have this morning, I'd like to show in 3 examples where the characteristics that Pope Benedict XVI highlights as fundamental to monastic culture and thus European and Western culture overlap with the conditions that foster the virtue of religion in the mind of Aquinas. Before I start, I think I have to note that probably contrary to what many of us in today's culture and society associate with religion, to St. Thomas Aquinas, religion, which is worship, is at the heart of a person who is morally, socially, and therefore also culturally aligned with God. Religion is not only outward practices to Aquinas. It's not rituals, institutions, and rites, but most fundamentally, religion is an interior virtue at the heart of what it is to be human, which transforms a person morally and ultimately unites and orders a society and a culture. Religion is the virtue most determinative for St. Thomas Aquinas of whether or not a person and a culture will attain to greater meaning and happiness. It is the highest of the moral virtues, and it is uniquely related to the practice of faith, hope, and charity for the Christian. We can contrast Aquinas' perspective on religion with the increased phenomenon today of those who identify themselves as nuns, or those persons who practice no religion and therefore see religion as entirely irrelevant to a happy life and culture. Now, to provide those 3 examples I mentioned of the parallels between the characteristics of monastic culture highlighted by Pope Benedict XVI and the conditions for the flourishing of religion in Aquinas. First, embracing the immaterial and therefore transcendent nature of reason is a primary condition for the flourishing of the virtue of religion in Aquinas, as well as an essential characteristic of the monastic culture that seeks and listens to the Word of God for Pope Benedict XVI. The virtue of religion, according to Aquinas, possesses an interior logic similar to that of justice. As a just person seeks equality and proportion with another person or persons of like nature, so the religious person inwardly seeks and desires to be right and just toward his Creator. Contemplating God's unique grandeur, his singular excellence, his immense generosity, the person who possesses the virtue of religion will inwardly ask with the psalmist, "What shall I render to the Lord for all his bounty to me?" The virtue of religion is therefore based on a judgment of reason, about the truth gained through the contemplation and meditation on the nature of God and man. For Aquinas, to reduce the capacity of the human intellect to seek to know about God by faith and reason is incompatible with the formation of true interior and exterior worship. To handicap the heights to which reason is called would be to handicap religion. For Pope Benedict XVI, it is also the role of reason, open to transcendence, that is crucial to the monastic culture that seeks God and listens to the Word of God. The former Holy Father describes the monastic culture as one which presupposes confidence in, quote, the universality of God and of reason open towards him, unquote. This is what gave monks, he says, their motivation, indeed their obligation, to proclaim the message. They saw their faith as belonging, quote, not to cultural custom that differs from one people to another, but to the domain of truth, which concerns all people equally, unquote. Again, Pope Benedict XVI wrote, quote, a purely positivistic culture which tried to drive the question concerning God into the subjective realm as being unscientific would be the capitulation of reason, the renunciation of the highest possibilities of reason, and hence a disaster for humanity with very grave consequences. He says, what gave Europe's culture its foundation, the search for God and the readiness to listen to him, remains today the basis for any genuine culture, unquote. The second parallel between what shapes monastic culture for Pope Benedict XVI and what characterizes the virtue of religion for Aquinas is the importance of what I would call a sacramental worldview. In the thought of Aquinas, the virtue of religion is first natural to all men, because it is rooted in the desire of every man, not only to seek to know and to love what is transcendent, eternal, and true, but to orient themselves entirely to the transcendent God, wholly, by body and soul. Because no act can be a truly fitting return to God for who he is and what he has done for us, religious acts employ signs, sacrifices, interior words and gestures. While these acts cannot give God something he needs, they attempt at least to signify both God's extreme benevolence and his transcendence, as well as his complete sovereignty as the source, sustenance, and end of our lives. The signs used to worship God proper to religion not only bespeak in language who God is, they indicate who we are in relation to God. These same signs inherently indicate that we, men and women, are not God, and that we owe him our very selves. They show an ontological dependence upon God. They show that our lives are subordinated to his plan of life and wisdom. Given that it is the whole person who owes his existence and life and every good that he enjoys to God, religious virtue is also necessarily expressed in acts that involve our whole person. Religious signs, acts, and gestures are, after all, intelligible in a way proportionate to human rationality. The point is that religious signs presuppose and communicate that we are corporeal and not spiritual only. They say we are delimited by time and matter, and that we are creatures of history. For Pope Benedict XVI, also, he described a logic of sacramentality inherent to the search for God by listening to the Word in the monastic culture. He wrote, quote, the Word of God only comes to us through the human Word, through human words, that God only speaks to us through the humanity of human agents, through their words and through their history. This means, again, he says, that the divine element in the word and in the words is not self-evident. The word acts as a kind of sacrament to the divine truth. Pope Benedict XVI describes the search for God in a monastic culture as one in which singing and the body and the senses and the deeply human are important. He writes about the critical task of perceiving in human language its divine meaning. Third and finally, Pope Benedict XVI highlights the importance of grasping the authentic meaning of freedom to the monastic culture. The true meaning of human freedom, likewise for Aquinas, is foundational to the virtue of religion. Aquinas goes so far as to claim that personal freedom grows in direct proportion to the virtue of religion and charity. The more one is oriented by his reason, his will, and his actions to the praise of God, the more he is free. To misunderstand freedom in relationship to God and the providence of grace of God would be, on the other hand, an obstacle to the development of religion. Likewise, for Benedict XVI, listening to the word requires human rationality, a sacramental perspective, but also creativity. But by this creativity, Pope Benedict XVI warns, we must not confuse voluntaristic freedom for creativity. The freedom that underlies authentic monastic culture is ordered by and to the universal and the true. Pope Benedict XVI wrote, quote, "The liberating spirit is not simply the exegete's own idea. The tension between obligation and freedom, which extends far beyond the literary problem of scriptural exegesis, has also determined the thinking and acting of monasticism, and has deeply marked Western culture. It would be a disaster," he says, "if today's European culture could only conceive freedom as absence of obligation." Unquote. In conclusion, what does showing the parallels between Aquinas and Benedict XVI open for us today? It allows us to see that the destruction of religion is the destruction of culture, and at the same time that the renewal of religion, understood with Aquinas in all its interiority, transcendence, and embodied sacramentality, is also integral to the salvation of true and authentic culture. Aquinas provides what one might call a theological and metaphysical confirmation of Pope Benedict XVI's thesis that monastic culture is the basis for European culture. Reason being oriented entirely to God and authentic freedom are the basis of culture, and they were lived very perfectly in the vowed monastic religious life. Within Benedict XVI's descriptions of the characteristics of monastic culture are also warnings about how a culture can be lost. The reduction of transcendent reasoning, the loss of sacramental worldview, and the misunderstanding and misuse of human freedom will erode an authentic culture. Considering Aquinas on religion, culture can be lost for the same reasons that religion can be lost, just as culture can be nourished by the same foundations that foster true religion. One can see how worship, prayer, and theology, or doctrine about God, not only developed European culture, but why the search for the transcendent and the virtue of religion are the foundations of every culture. In Europe, the search for the transcendent was formed uniquely by the infused virtue of religion given to the baptized in Christ. In particular, it was monks and the monastic life who embodied the virtue of religion in a radical way, becoming living signs of the communion of the kingdom to come, the city of God. It was the special way that the monastic life prepared men and women to be worshippers of God that therefore formed the unique European monastic culture as a sign of the ultimate culture, the future kingdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Mother Mary Krista. Father Maurice, over to you.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I am going to presuppose and assume the insights already shared with us by Mother Christa. What I intend doing with the minutes I have is to contribute in three directions to this great address that the Holy Father gave at the College de Benedict, September 12, 2008. And my first contribution has to do with what I see as the structure of the dialogue, the structure of the address regarding the searching for God, the querere Deum, the searching for God, the seeking of what Benedict called the eschatological. And I found his definition of eschatological, which is already highlighted, very refreshing. Not about the telos, about the end, but the definitive behind the provisional. The structure of that, as per Benedict, unfolds in three layers. The first, the culture of the word, the aura, and I think a healthy insight from the treatment of the culture of the word, taking into considerations already what Sister highlighted, has to do with the theme of the living community as the home of the Bible, as the home of the Word. In other words, it is a reminder of what Benedict frequently alluded to. On the one hand, the gains of the historical critical method. On the other hand, the limits of the method. So much so that the word, the aura, finds a living reality in the living body of the church. So I wanted to highlight that regarding the culture of the word. The second culture that Benedict, following the Benedictine tradition, engaged has to do with the labora, the culture of work. And he says work is not something by the slaves as per the Greek understanding. Rather, when we work, we resemble God who continues to work. And the Holy Father cites John 5:17. My Father is working still, and I am working. So you have the culture of the word, the culture of work. And one typically Ratzingerian insight or methodology is how he brings these two aspects of the querere Deum together, the seeking of God together. Where is there a Ratzingerian synthesis between ora and labora? Where do you find that synthesis? He himself provides the answer. He says the Christocentric center of ora and labora. So both the culture of the ora and the culture of the labora find their grounding because God has revealed himself, which does not consist in a thought but in a deed. John 1:14, et verbum caro factum est. And the Holy Father says, amid what is made, the factum, there is now logos. Logos is among us. Creation, factum, is rational. Naturally, the humility of reason is always needed in order to accept it. Human humility which responds to God's humility. So that, in my opinion, constitutes the structure of the Benedict address, the Ora, the Labora, and the Christocentric Center. I will switch gears to the second insight I wanted to bring to the conversation, and namely the alternative worldview to this monastic, deeply Christocentric worldview that the Pope engages in the first part of the address. The second, or the alternative to that, is what he calls a zone of dissimilarity, the regio dissimilitudinis, the zone of dissimilarity. And Sister again attributed to that the positivistic culture, which from his own diagnosis constitutes a remoteness from God, a distance. It no longer reflects the human being as the imago Dei. So you have four distances created as a result of this positivistic culture. The first, the distance from God. The second, the distance from the self. The third, the distance from the neighbor. And the fourth, the distance from creation. So in effect, this positivistic culture creates a nihilistic vacuum, if you put it that way, in the human being. And so we have now before us, to use a Hegelian phrase, a thesis and an antithesis. The two of them standing before us, and we have to make a choice. We have to make a choice. That, to me, is the second highlight that I wanted to put out for our consideration from the lecture. This positivistic culture, it renounces the highest possibilities. And Sister again alluded to this, as it brings about, or it spells a disaster for humanity with grave consequences. Now, the third part of my contribution is to put Benedict in the context of others that have thought about this question of a zone of dissimilarity. Sister engaged him with Aquinas. I wanted to look at Benedict from the philosophical engagement of the question of the positivistic culture. And I spontaneously would tend to Pascal, the Pensées, where Pascal captures this dialectic or this dynamism of the human being without God. What kind of anthropology and sociology emerges? And Pascal talks about a life characterized by two platforms, diversion and indifference. So you can see that when what Benedict refers to as the distance from the self, to Pascal, that stands out in a life in which we run away, we occupy the space, we are quick to occupy the space because we can't face the reality of who we are. The second thinker that I find a deeper affinity between Ratzinger and him is Joseph Paper. Leisure, the basis of culture. There we find again this whole thinking in which the center of pre-Enlightenment culture was the cult, the worship. So that transcendental openness. And now, once Kant declared that he had to shut the door to knowledge to make room for faith, and that set the whole trajectory rolling, German idealism. Then we get to a point in which that transcendental or the vertical dimension of culture is eclipsed. And as Pepper says, there is a flattening of culture. That cult that used to provide a peak period for the human being is no longer there. We just have a complete flattening of time. The interplay between Kairos and Chronos evaporates. Sunday no longer becomes the first day of the week, the day of worship, from which we derive the energy to face the other days. So much so that labora becomes now a very oppressive reality. Work loses its humane character. I find in Piper a very deep interconnection with Benedict in this regard. The third thinker is Dawson, Dynamics of World History. And there he builds again on this aspect of a culture that eliminates the vertical dimension. So a horizontal understanding of culture. And the graphic manifestation of this is the techno-scientific entertainment that we have. And to Dawson, this is not culture. I think he will be in good company here with Joseph Pepe as well. Because once the cult is taken out of culture, it is a replacement of culture. So sometimes, in effect, technically, to talk about an entertainment culture, a technological culture, a scientific culture, if by that we mean a positivistic understanding of it, it's not really a culture, but a replacement of culture. Sports, soccer, the new cathedrals, Manchester United versus Arsenal. So that kind of way of looking at culture excludes that which was the ground of culture, that which held culture together. So that is the third aspect I wanted to highlight. And now, my conclusion. What is Benedict's way forward? He doesn't have the method of the prophet Amos to denounce everything and characterize everything in a melancholic, pessimistic notion. Benedict is not that. If anything, his recommendation is very simple. The path forward towards this cultural replacement is the outward proclamation of Jesus. That is what Benedict recommends. It is not enough to denounce the replacements of culture by science, by technology, by entertainment. It is even more important, and perhaps crucially important, that we outwardly proclaim Jesus. And the effectiveness of our outward proclamation will be contingent on our inward relationship with Jesus. Because, as the old Latin saying goes, you cannot give what you do not have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Father Maurice, are we set with the Zoom? All right. Very good. So perhaps in the interim, I might invite both of you, if you have any immediate questions or responses to one another. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
Or maybe some insights from others as well?
I had one. Can I use this? I had one thought about the way that our two talks were in some way complementary, was the mystery of looking at the. You talked about the humility of reason that Cardinal Ratzinger emphasizes, and I was looking at the heights of reason, what it can attain to, and I think there's a beautiful balance that he emphasizes in this talk: the humility to submit freedom, and the humility to seek within a communion of persons, at the same time that that communion of persons together dares to let reason and faith seek the transcendent together. I thought there was a beautiful, important emphasis that each of us differently picked up on, but that they're both needed in regard to reason. There can't be a proud hubris in the search for God any more than we can dampen the possibility of reason reaching out to God.
Father.
Thank you, Mother, and thank you, Father, for your beautiful presentations. Just a contribution which I find very much in line with what you're talking about, very beautiful. It's what happens, especially today, with the flattening of culture or with the eclipse of the transcendent. Sister Foot said, what happens is there is this tendency within man to fill this void besides diversion or besides leisure. There is a new tendency to grasp or to stretch out the hand towards the transcendent, but then building a human transcendence, so to speak, which is something we cannot do on our own. We call that a utopia, which expresses itself in politics or in the new home movement, so-called transhumanism, where man wants to build a transcendence or an eternity which is made by man himself, trying to construct a future without God, which would last and perpetuate, to which becomes a failure in the end. I think that was very beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father. I am thinking of the work by de Lubac, the drama of atheistic humanism here, that it's possible to build a world without God. We have tried to do it severally in the past and even now, but then we all know how the story often ends. We end up building it against each other.
I've been informed that our third guest is present, if virtually. So let's hear from Remy Brague. Let me reread his bio by way of introduction. Remy Brague is a French historian of philosophy specializing in Islamic, Jewish, and Christian thought of the Middle Ages. He's professor emeritus of medieval and Arabic philosophy at the Sorbonne and holds the Romano Guardini Chair of Philosophy at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. He is a member of the Institut de France in the Academy of Moral and Political Sciences, and in 2012 he received the Ratzinger Prize from Pope Benedict XVI and the Ratzinger Foundation.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid I can hear you, well, rather badly, but still, I do my best. I do hope you can hear me. Can you?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, up to a point, let's say, up to a point.
You're quite audible, don't worry.
Let me first tell you how deeply I regret not to be able to be among you in the flesh. But still, have unfortunately pretty good reasons to be nailed to my place here in Paris. Well, be that as it may, my task here consists in commenting upon Pope Benedict's speech in Paris in September the 12th, 2008. I was given the opportunity to draw upon this speech in a talk I gave in New York in October 2016. It was published in a booklet, well, published at the University of Notre Dame Press in 2019. Consequently, I will have to repeat parts of what I said already. But I'll try to avoid old hat as much as I can, and I'll introduce some new insights. Let me begin with a personal remembrance. I had been invited to be part of the audience which was scheduled to listen to Pope Benedict's talk. I sat there among the crème de la crème of Parisian intelligentsia. All of them, or the bulk of them, were there. I could put a name on almost all the big shots of politics, literature, and the arts. Yet there was a lady, a leading figure of art criticism, whom I was at great pains to identify, for she had her clothes on. But as the Pope delivered his speech, I saw perplexity painting itself in the faces. All those brilliant intellectuals were obviously flabbergasted. What was the point of this exposé on monastic life? And they were all the more taken aback that Pope Benedict was addressing people for whom, or for a part of whom, the implicit and for some explicit rule of life consisted in being at loggerheads with the three traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. I won't endeavor to plume myself with the role of the ironical observer looking down on stupid people, for I was surprised too. Talking to people whose job it is to produce, diffuse, and/or critically assess the quality of cultural wares, I surmise that Pope Benedict deliberately had chosen to brush his audience against the nap. To be more precise, he was subverting them by reminding them of the context which made possible the very place in which he spoke and the trades they were plying. This place used to be a convent before it was impounded by the French Revolution and turned into barracks for the fire brigade. Archbishop Lustiger managed to get it back from the state and turn into what had to be named a cultural center. Originally, however, it was made by and for Cistercian monks, an order which Saint Bernard of Clairvaux reformed to steer it towards a stricter application of the rule. The Pope chose to explain the meaning of monastic life, taking his bearings from a work in French, the wonderfully learned and insightful book by Don Jean Leclerc, himself a monk. The central topic of the speech is the very possibility of culture. This culture, we are prone to look at it as something we can take for granted, and even as our property, as an heirloom we have legitimately inherited and in which we could be shown around with a smile of satisfaction. Pope Benedict reminds us that monks never aimed at creating culture, not even at transmitting a pre-existing culture. This they undoubtedly did, and were very successful. Let us think, for instance, of Cassiodorus and the convent of Vivarium he grounded in 555. The monks salvaged huge chunks of classical culture. We owe them the survival of the flotsam and jetsam of the great cultural shipwreck of late antiquity. Furthermore, they produced new masterpieces of architecture, music, poetry, and even philosophy. They did that by accident, as the collateral byproducts of another search, the search for God, quaerere Deum, as Pope Benedict never tired of repeating. Pope Benedict mentions the modern catchword of creativity. But he observes that the monks didn't even dream of such a feat, which, if literally and technically understood as creatio ex nihilo, would challenge the privilege of the only true creator, to wit, God. Culture is the result of our effort towards God. Great creators of culture hardly ever wanted to create culture. An example which I find especially relevant is another Pope, Gregory the Great, who died in 604. This Pope lived far earlier than Pope Benedict, who nevertheless quotes him as still relevant for us. The reforms he introduced made possible the basic elements of medieval culture. Yet, Pope Gregory believed that the world was in the last throes of decline. The end was at hand. Consequently, he understood himself as the last pope, or if worse didn't come to worse, the last but one. He felt his task, or his duty, was to do what was to be done, to act for the best, right now. This is important for us for two reasons. First, we feel in our bones that something like an end is drawing near, although we don't know exactly what is doomed and how it will sweep out of our ken. Hence, it is important that we should know how properly to cross the threshold. Second, we have been witnessing in some decades the rise of a new kind of people for whom I ventured in the early 90s to coin en passant the moniker Christianists. Whereas Christians believe in Christ, Christianists believe in the worth, dignity, beauty, you name it, of Christian civilization or of Christian values without any commitment to faith in Christ. As a first step, I wholeheartedly and joyfully condone this attitude, not because those people are our objective allies, but simply because what they say is true. They are right to stress a fact which every unbiased historian acknowledges, i.e., the utterly positive part played by Christianity in world history, world culture. Yet, I would object to their attitude on 3 points. First, I regret that Christianists don't think that what was good for our forebears could be good for us too, and for them as well. They too easily yield to the modern legend of progress. But this is another story. I won't belabor the point here. As a consequence, that's my second point, I regret that their stance may help us to keep what is already extant, but can scarcely foster new achievements. More fundamentally, and this is my third point, I regret that those people sever the good from the true. For us too, for us Christians too, Christianity is quite a good thing. But it is good because it is true, full stop. Pope Benedict reminds us that faith doesn't belong to culture, but to truth. For the monks, as well as for Aristotle and for us, truth is harbored in thought, which expresses itself in logos. Now, the monks spent a great deal of their time in prayer. to be precise, in collective prayer, and to be still more precise, in singing the psalms. Prayer is a linguistic activity of a very special kind. This use of language hints towards a broader view of Logos, doing justice to all its dimensions. Among those dimensions, we find reason, but a reason understood not only as the reckoning ability suggested by the Latin etymology, ratio from reor, to calculate, to reckon, but reason conceived of as the ground of freedom and sensible action. And we find too, in this broader view of reason, the collective dimension of the Logos, hence its rhetoric and poetic uses. Christianity, in the wake of the religion of Israel, understands human reason as somehow attuned to the reason present in the universe, namely, to the reason in which and for which the universe was created. According to a passage of Isaiah, which I commented upon elsewhere, that's chapter 45, verse 18, 19, God talks sense. God hates obscure language. God hates lack of order in creation. All those dimensions are captured in those two verses. To put it with the New Testament, which, by the way, echoes the very first sentence of Genesis, at the beginning, there was the Logos, and whatever came into being was created in the Logos. This is an idea which Pope Benedict repeatedly drives home. The God of the Christians is Word. The God of the Christians is Logos. He is, if I may say so, a meaningful God, a God who invites us to ask about the meaning of what is. Nietzsche, the German philosopher Nietzsche, who was not exactly a good Christian, coined a formula which, in the teeth of his own intentions, suggests this. I'm afraid, quote, I'm afraid we won't get rid of God, since we still believe in grammar. Ich fürchte, wir werden Gott nicht los, weil wir noch an die alte Grammatik glauben. The philosopher wanted to expose the way in which grammatical categories foster metaphysical ideas. For instance, that the grammatical category of subject can be easily but mistakenly transposed to the metaphysical category of substance and make us believe in the substantiality of the self. Yet, we can turn Nietzsche's regretful utterance back to front and read it in a positive key, as an affirmation according to which God and rationality, God and meaning, can't be thought of apart from each other. As long as we will keep talking sense, and provided we are fair and rigorous thinkers, we will have to reach through to the idea of God. Singing the psalms in keeping with the voices of the universe, says Pope Benedict, quote, brings the word to its highest destiny. May I venture here to put forward a paradox? Those songs of praise, although they develop in another level, do very much the same thing as science. Both pursuits look for a logos which could dovetail with the logos present in the world. In the same way as poetry endeavors to translate into human words the silent language of things, and here I'm thinking of Eichendorff's well-known poem, according to which a song lies sleeping in everything. I'm thinking too of Marcel Proust's, my fellow countryman, utterance about the presence of a beautiful sentence lying hidden behind a beautiful landscape. In the same way as poetry does that, science looks for a formula in which nature would sort of confess, would sort of unveil itself such as she is, would reveal its inner logos. In both cases, to quote the admirable saying of the Latin church father Lactantius, reason knows reason, rationem ratio cognoscit. Reason in us, well, is in keeping with reason in reality, in the things. For Christians, there is logos in the universe because the universe is the work of a deeply rational God. Because the universe is the language in which God speaks. By this token, the human use of logos is none other than echoing the logos which is embedded in the universe, answering what the Creator told us and keeps telling us. Our logos is always an answer. And by this token, the ultimate ground of culture, and here I come back to my topic of culture, the ultimate ground of culture is none other than cult. This play on words is ancient. The Latin verb collere meant tilling the soil, but worshipping a godhead too. Pope Benedict doesn't pun, but the idea underlies his whole speech. So far so good. But what about us? To the best of my knowledge, we are not monks, or at least some among us, including my humble self, are not. Yet all of us are post-medieval. Therefore, we must cope with two questions. First, what happens when culture and cult drift apart or even get counter to each other? In one of his last novels, Dr. Faustus, the German writer Thomas Mann, who died in 1955, puts on the stage a discussion between his central character, the composer Adrian Leverkühn, and the devil in person. The latter is explaining, quote, "Since culture fell away from the cult and made a cult of itself, it has become nothing else than a falling away. And all the world, after a mere 500 years, is as sick and tired of it as though they had ladled it in with cooking spoons." We hardly know whether, in Thomas Mann's novel, whether the devil is an external, personal being, suppose he deserved this last adjective, or if he is only the phantasmagoric exteriorization of a hidden dimension of Adrian Leverkühn, very much as this happens with the devil which appears to Ivan, the bespectacled nihilist intellectual among the three brothers Karamazov. The devil may be a liar, according to John, to the fourth gospel. But here, he does talk sense. He probably echoes and draws the ultimate conclusion from what the same Ivan Karamazov had told his younger brother Alyosha. Europe is a very dear churchyard, the dearest of all, but a churchyard all the same. Be that as it may, we may distinguish in The Devil's Utterance in Thomas Mann's novel 4 stages. First, the birth and rise of a profane culture by its branching off from the sacred culture, well, weighing its anchors vis-a-vis cult. Second, as a compensation, culture making itself, or faking itself, if I may say so, as a new kind of cult. For instance, a religion of art or a religion of scientific inquiry. Third step, decadence of culture. And finally, fourth and last step, a generalized loathing for whatever presents itself as cultural. I'm afraid those 4 steps tally rather well with what happened and is still happening to Western culture. The second question is more radical still. What is at stake is not how a culture would look like if it were utterly secularized, totally severed from cult. It is rather to know in the first place whether something like culture, generally meaning, would be possible in a world which would have totally done away with a nourishing soil from which it drew its energy. In a passage of the German original, which Pope Benedict did not pronounce in the French oral version, we read this short but pithy sentence. The culture of singing is also a culture of being. Die Kultur des Singens ist auch Kultur des Seins. The phrase is noteworthy, although, or perhaps because, or even all the more, that it is somehow a tautology. Each and every culture is a culture of being. A culture of nothingness would destroy itself. Here a last ground of culture comes to the fore, a ground which I can't help not calling ontological. There can't be any culture without the affirmation of the goodness of being. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bragg, for those remarks. I'm told we have perhaps 15 minutes or so for questions, discussion. If you have something to ask our presenters, please come forward to the standing mics, because that will be much better for the Zoom connection. They're contemplating their questions. Perhaps I can take moderator's privilege and ask one to begin with. This is something that Father Maurice touched on briefly, and then you mentioned as well, Professor Bragg, with your experience witnessing the speech. Perhaps we can transcribe it into the Zoom for you. But the question I want to ask is, what about the political stakes of the speech, in a way? Because what the Pope did is very bold in not just offering a history of something very safe and academic of the role that the monks played in the Middle Ages, right? But he said it with the president present. He said it with leaders of civil society present. and he made an argument about principles and causes and not just effects. I would invite perhaps any of the three of you to say, what can we learn from that rhetorical boldness in that context?
Well, I'm afraid it was part of a more or less consciously felt policy on the side of our French president, the president who already was number one in France and who is still there for some years still. And well, he most probably, when the Pope spoke, he was addressing perhaps a country which used to be there when he was, as a young man, a reader of the great French poets and theologians, the people whom we call Catholic novelists or Catholic writers. And I'm afraid the situation has changed, and not for the better, but definitely for the worse. For at present, the people whom the Pope was addressing had almost nothing to do with the authors whom Pope Benedict read with so great thirst for knowledge and for beauty when he was a student and still when he was a university lecturer in Tübingen and in other places. So there is some sort of gap between, there used to be a gap between the Pope and his audience. To be sure, there were in the audience, some committed Catholics, and I'm happy to say that I was there too as such, but still the echo of the Pope's speech was, not, I couldn't say it was negative, but it was almost, indifference and lack of understanding for what was at stake in his delineating the intentions of medieval monastic life. I alluded to that when I said that the people who were there were very far from the three vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They even had written on their as their motto rather the contrary: transgression, debauchery, and richness. And but this does not prevent us from understanding how deep the Pope probed, how deep he probed in the wounds of our present-day culture. For whoever takes as his or her motto the contrary of the three vows and the contrary of what monastic life was all about, finds him or herself caught in a logics which leads to destruction of culture and ultimately to self-destruction. This is what I was alluding to at the very end of my speech when I said that a culture of nothingness would destroy itself. And we may be venturing right now, I mean Western culture might be trying at present to to risk the experiment of a culture of nothingness, what Pope John Paul called the culture of death. And well, his immediate successor, Pope Benedict, took up the cue and tried to explain how a real culture of life would look like. And this is what he was doing. So there are political stakes, but in the long run, nothing to do with pettifogging political, games in present-day France.
My name is Michael Waldstein. I remember with great gratitude our time at Demel in Vienna at the Cafe House. We spoke. I was in Gamming at that point, teaching. You said the immediate reaction at the lecture was misunderstanding and indifference. Do you see any long-term effect, any return, any further reflection in French culture in particular, or did it simply die off at the moment?
Well, it depends. It depends who felt concerned by the speech. In the Catholic world, it triggered a reflection. In people like myself, for instance. But I'm happy to say that I was not alone to do that. I'm not the only one who ventured. Who risked the adventure of trying to think through what Pope Benedict meant. But among non-Christian intellectuals, I'm afraid I couldn't put my finger on the name of people who really reacted, really tried to cope with. To confront what the Pope told us. It arose in Catholic circles a thirst for the study of monastic life, not entering convents, but trying to reflect on what made Christian culture possible in the first place.
Good morning. My name is Max Bonilla. I'm the provost at St. Mary's University in Minnesota. Thank you for your interesting presentations. A question that has bothered me for many years, now 21 years in administration, university administration, is beyond these conversations, which are very helpful to us in the academic side. I wonder what advice you would give to university administrators, board of trustees, presidents, and cabinets particularly, for the transformation of the university culture that mirrors very much what you have discussed in the general culture in Europe, but also in the United States. And given that universities are very much at the center of shaping culture, particularly in the United States, I would be very interested to hear what you'd have to say, what St. Thomas would say, or others might want to help us. Thank you. This is our question for any of you.
When I read Pope Benedict XVI's address, one of the things he speaks about is the formation of the mind of the monks, how through prayer, but also how study emerged out of their style of life, study being a very important component of monastic life. And this may seem simple, but philosophical education is a piece of this, inviting into prayer, if cult is a basis for culture. And in a Catholic university, we have opportunity to invite into education of the mind and prayer. it seems these are wonderful ways to start. And I mean education of the mind, perhaps more in the way of St. John Henry Newman. So looking carefully at what kind of formation of the mind, how the culture deforms the mind, and then what kinds of educational opportunities will allow for the formation of the mind and the whole person. And I think there's a strong movement, even in elementary and middle school, toward a classical education for the formation of the mind of young people. And it seems to be giving some opportunities, especially when there's a combination in the school of religious presence, lay presence, who invite the young people into prayer, into the piety of the church. I mean, the church gives us cult in a beautiful way. So when we invite into the church's practices and the formation of the mind together, there's a strong possibility. But I think we, in the university and in the even lower education, have to appreciate and agree, in a sense, on where are the philosophical and theological deformations, and then how do we offer to young people. And this is just a little example. I have a sister who teaches sophomores, and she teaches them about the attributes of God. And it eliminates many of their misconceptions about God and the obstacles they have to faith. And they come to the church, they enter the church, and she has a statement at the end of their time where it says, I used to think this about God, now I think. And they're profound. A 10th grader will say, I used to think God was cruel or impotent because bad things happen. Now I understand that God is all good and that the human will has introduced certain evils into the world. That's profound for a young person to be able to straighten out the crooked lines that the culture sometimes informs them in.
Well, let me first make a preliminary statement on Catholic universities. I was given the opportunity, a matter of 2 years ago, if my memory serves me right, I was given the opportunity of giving a talk in Madrid, in Spain. And, well, I'm afraid the text was published in Spanish only. Well, I'll have to translate it. Anyway, my topic was Catholic University as a tautology. The idea, well, thought-provoking to be sure, was that each and every university is consciously or not Catholic. And this has historical reasons. Or universities arose in the Latin Catholic West in the Middle Ages. And they were supposed to transmit not only the liberal arts, but theology, or perhaps, let me put things upside down, not only theology, which was sort of normal, but the liberal arts, i.e. profane sciences, profane lore and science, illuminated by the presence of theological truth, illuminated by the idea according to which whatever is true is good, and whatever is good is also beautiful, and whatever is true is worth being taught and learnt. And well, as far as present problems of the university are concerned, well, I would say, well, of course, that's rather difficult to put into practice in the present situation of universities. By the way, I hope that Notre Dame, well, could keep aloof from from this tidal wave of resentment and of self-hatred, which is sweeping through the whole Western world. For we are very much in the same predicament on the other side of the pond, and especially in France. Well, be that as it may, well, the principle of the university life is that there are things that are better than what we are, things that, are worth being looked for, things that are worth being studied, learned, and possibly assimilated, simply because they are true, beautiful, and good. And as soon as we leave this idea alone, as soon as we part company with this basic principle, we are sort of doomed to fall into all those scenes of self-pity, self-hatred, and lack of interest, due to an excessive and perverse love of oneself, but severed from the very idea of the good, to speak like Plato. And well, this is a tall order that I am giving at present, But getting back to getting back to the transcendentals. Well, I'm speaking for an audience which is familiar, I guess, with medieval philosophical and theological thought. If we don't get back to the transcendentals, we'll leave aside being itself, and university will disappear, perhaps together with the world which gave university its existence, i.e. the Western world. For is no such thing in other parts of the world, barring what other parts of the world imported from the Latin West.
Well, on that note, I think we are at the end of our session, and we should have at least some time left for the break. So please join me in thanking Remy Brague, Mother Mary Christa, Father Maurice, and I hope we can continue the conversation afterwards. Thanks very much.